1907. That's when Christopher Newport first landed at the fall line of the James River. And when he did so, he planted a cross there in honor of King James. And that's near that same location. There is a statue that's been erected of a cross that was placed there in 1907, exactly 300 years later. And that's still in 12th and Canal Street, I believe. A couple blocks kind of west of where we are right now, so toward the front end of the boat. But the canal history itself, while they talked about plans to build a canal prior to the Revolutionary War, the war interrupted any such ideas they may have had about that. But once we had successfully won our independence as a country, in 1784, George Washington went to the Virginia General Assembly and suggested they move forward in earnest with the construction of a canal to bypass the fall line at Richmond. In 1785, the James River Company was formed, and they made George Washington the honorary president. He definitely was just an honorary president because he was going to be president of a much bigger organization very soon. He thought he was going to retire, but he wasn't so lucky. And construction started about 1790, 1795 in that area, the planning and construction phase, and it was complete enough to start using it in 1800. In 1800, they had completed the Great Basin, which would have been at the location that sits right below where the Omni Hotel is today. So at the top of the hill to our right, you won't be able to see it past the tree line. But it's about 69 feet up. So in order to bypass the falls, boats had to get from the water level here at the canal to the water level of the river beyond the fall line, which is a good 69 or so feet higher than its level. Well, the way they did that was by use of locks. And if you look straight ahead where the water is flowing in, that's underneath one of two granite locks that remains from improvements made to the canal in 1854. Now prior to that, they had about 13 wooden locks in this section of the canal. It's a 7-mile section known as the Tidewater Connection, which essentially bypasses the fall line, much like an interstate would bypass the city to make traffic move more smoothly. But as you can imagine, wood and water don't mix over the long term, so they did decide to improve that. And in 1854, they made those improvements. So this section of the canal would have been completed by 1812 and in full use. The canal extends from Richmond all the way to Lynchburg and even past Lynchburg a little bit into Buchanan County. And the Lynchburg connection was completed in about 1840. 1851 they finished all the way to Buchanan, and that's what, as long as the canal got, despite plans to construct it all the way to the Kanawha River. And that might sound like a long period, starting in 1795 and taking over 50 years. But recall at the time, they would have been using shovels, pickaxes, hand axes. It was all manual labor to connect the canal. It's over 197 miles long. And it was originally a lot wider than this, but they had to work around rocks just like the ones at the fall line. They had to unearth these and break them up, haul them out of the way, cut through tree roots, dig out the canal and lay down blocks on the sides of the canal to form the walls. It's a very laborious process. Now this building to our left can give you sort of a mini time capsule look at the history of Richmond. Notice the different architecture. We've got some small stones, one section of very large stone, and then brick on top of that. Well, now the very large stone section is actually the original canal wall. The building was built on top of the canal wall, and over its history it has served as the Virginia Paper Company. It also at one time was the Lady Bird Hat Factory, But in 1865, it would have been burned all the way down to its foundation. Because in that year, the Union Army was moving on Richmond after having won a long siege of Petersburg, and the Confederates decided they had no option but to evacuate. So Jefferson Davis ordered the Confederate Army to set the torch to anything that might be of use to the Union. And that included any warehouses that were along the canal down here. And as it turns out, almost everything at that time was wood and timber construction, so over 1,000 buildings burned. Construction was so bad that the residents who fled during the fire and later returned to Richmond couldn't find the street they lived on, much less their house. It was all demolished. For his part, Jefferson Davis escaped by train, and it was just 100 yards or so from us. The wood to the left at the top of this hill is a small green grassy area, and then an outdoor sort of patio. And that building at the top of the hill is the Southern Railway Tap House, which is a wonderful restaurant, by the way. But at one time it was a rail station. Most recently the Southern Railway rail station, but in 1865 it was known as the Richmond-Danville Railway. And Jefferson Davis would have stood about where that awning is today to board the train, carrying with him all the Confederate gold and several of the Confederate officials. They were hoping to relocate and reestablish another capital somewhere. But it's just a few short days later that Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant in Appomattox. The Confederate Army fled. I think we have some people partial to the Union on board. But then Robert Lee had fled with the Army, got as far as Appomattox, and realized he was surrounded, and really there was no choice but to surrender at that point. So Richmond has definitely been through some periods of having to reconstruct. That was one significant one in its history, and there have also been other fires and several floods. So in the Chaco neighborhood that we're going through now, you see a lot of Italian-made brick construction. Most of that was completed after the Civil War as a result of reconstruction of the buildings that had burned. Now coming up, on our right there's going to be a railroad line just on the ground, but on the other side of this pedestrian walkway you'll notice two train trusses. One sort of medium height, if you will, and one higher. Now all three of those will cross the same point over here to the right. That's known as the triple crossing. And when they first started to run, this was the only three mainline triple crossing in the world. One of the medallions on the canal wall still refers to it that way. There is at least one other that was built in Kansas City, but it's so new that it was built after the medallion was put in there. To our left is known as Box Brown Plaza. If you look at the top of this hill, kind of in between the bushes, you'll see a replica of a brown box that Henry Brown used to mail himself to Philadelphia in order to escape slavery. This was in 1849, so prior to the Civil War, but at the height of the tensions regarding slavery, with the different views on slave states versus free states, abolitionists, pro-slavery personalities, and so on. Well, Henry's situation was kind of typical of a lot of the slave folks at that time. He had been born into slavery on a plantation down in Louisa County. At the age of 15, his master hired him out to come work at a tobacco factory here in Richmond. Henry worked there until he was in his early 30s. And along the way, he met fellow enslaved person named Nancy. They got married, had 3 kids. Had a 4th child on the way. And Henry had been paying, out of his modest salary, paying Nancy's master a little bit to ensure that he would not sell Nancy and the kids away from Richmond. And despite this arrangement, after a certain amount of time, Nancy's master unfortunately did make the decision to sell Nancy and the kids, Nancy being pregnant at the time. And they were sold down to North Carolina. So Henry, at that point, decides, okay, I've got to get out of here. And with the help of Samuel Smith, who was a local white businessman, sympathizer, and abolitionist himself, and James Smith, no relation to Sam, who's a free black, they worked together with some abolitionists up in Philadelphia and came up with a plan to get Henry up there by way of a crate, about 3 feet by 2 feet by 2.5 feet. So imagine the replica box there is the same size. It's not a comfortable ride. Now Henry was able to earn a modest salary, and he ended up putting a lot in savings, but he had to spend half of his life savings, about $86 at the time, in order to afford the postage to ship himself to Philadelphia. Alright, so here's our flow log, but just watch your elbows and your hands. Now $86 in 1849 money works out to over $3,200 in today's money. So that was no small amount. Furthermore, since he was employed at the tobacco factory, the only way he was going to be able to execute his plan was if he was able to get a day off of work. Henry was so determined that he purposely burned his hand with sulfuric acid so that he'd have an injury to excuse him off for the day's work. And Sam and James Smith went ahead and boxed Henry up, and they marked the box fragile, this side up, handled with care, anything they could put on to try to keep Henry safe. And the trip took about 27 hours. He was on and off of wagons, railway, steamboat, and as a result, despite all their precautions, he did spend about a third of the trip upside down. About 9 hours. Looks like one of our geese friends was hunting there a minute ago. Somehow he maintained his spirits when his connections in Philadelphia released him from the box. His first words were reported to have been, "How do you do, gentlemen?" This section of the canal is between 20 and 25 feet deep around the center. It gets a little shallower at the ends, but ships were able to come in up to this point as dock over to our left to load or unload goods. And mostly coming out of Virginia, there would have been a lot of tobacco and wheat, some other agricultural products as well. They'd be shipped all around the world. Goods would go from Richmond as far away as Brazil and South America, or as far away as Australia. And of course, goods would come in from Europe, so this is a bustling port. And at its height, during the 1850s, the canal had about 195 bateaux, which is a French word for the type of flat-bottom boat that was used. They're also called barges. 195 in operation. And they were much larger than the boat we're on right now. This boat's about 30 feet long. Those barges would have been about 30 feet wide and up to 165 feet long. And they could carry up to 60 tons of cargo. And the way they would transport them is by using what's called a tow path system. And essentially a flat path like a roadway would have been leveled out adjacent to the canal, so that horses or mules could have been tied to barges to tow them upstream. It didn't need as much horsepower to come downstream. At the time, there was a current in the canal because it flowed just literally straight from James today we have facilities that pump the water into the canal to keep the level under control. And it does empty out into the James, so this is still river water, but just not open at both ends like it would have been in Richmond. Yes?
What are those things that are sticking up from the railroad?
Okay, so on our left is a trestle, and those platforms that are protruding out are actually where signalmen used to stand to signal the trains. This would have been before the use of electric signals. They would have been using hand lanterns lit with candles. And these guys would, I'm not sure how long their shifts were, but they would stand up there with their lanterns and signal the trains. I can't imagine what it might have been like to be standing there with a train thundered by. This track is just like all the others in Triple Crossing. This is still in use today. CSX uses this particular line.
Are there two tracks that are from the lower
This one has got, it's the one higher track, but there are a couple of different sort of connections that come off it. And then that middle line that we saw goes in a different direction. The lowest line runs over beside us on this land, which is, it's a man-made island known as Chapel Island. So named because at one time there was a church on the island where people would worship. Early in its history, I'm going to look and see. I have never seen that particular guy fly across before. I want to say kingfisher is a species, but don't quote me on that. I haven't read that page of the training manual yet. But Chapel Island was originally used as a ferry station as well that would ferry folks back and forth between Richmond and Manchester, which at the time was a separate township. At one time there was almost a small war over it because there was a bad smallpox outbreak in Richmond, and the folks in Manchester wanted no part of that, so they wouldn't let people cross. And eventually the government had to get involved, and they came up with a compromise that would allow people that had business in Manchester to go across, but they had certain areas that they had to traverse around the outside of Manchester in order to get their business done. Now also at the far end of Chapel Island is the Great Shiplock Park, just on the other side of the bridge you see in the distance from us. And there used to be a shipyard called the Tiggs Shipyard. Some elements of which, although they've been overgrown with vegetation, can still be found. Some of the concrete sections of the shipyard where they would dock and work on the boats. On the left-hand side, this would have been known in the 1800s as Tobacco Row, because at the time there were more than 50 warehouses and factories. So naturally they would call it Tobacco Row because of the row of tobacco warehouses. It's still called Tobacco Row today. In fact, there's a set of apartments over there, one section called the Tobacco Row Apartments. And that section is all residential and commercial now. But I've taken to calling the other side of the canal Turtle Row, because that's where we see the most turtles. You don't see as many during the summer as we typically do in spring. In spring you'll see about a dozen, piled all on top of any driftwood that you see on that side of the canal. I'm going to get us a little closer, see if we can get a peek at a couple.
So cool, the breeze is
We do have several
cool.
different species
You
of
feel the breeze
turtles
there?
hang out in the canal with us. There are box turtles, cooters, sliders, painted turtles. They do also, we do have some of those large snapping turtles. You'll see one every once in a while. And they're just as mean as their reputation would suggest. And also on the left-hand side, the area right under this trestle is part of the Virginia Capitol Trail. There's a paved pathway that runs from Richmond all the way to Williamsburg, And prior to Richmond being the capital, Williamsburg was the capital of Virginia. Prior to that, Jamestown would have been the capital for a short while. But the trail runs between the two largest historical capitals, Richmond and Williamsburg. About a 50-mile journey. And this section of it has also been turned into a green space known as the Low Line. It's a bit of a play on words because there's a High Line in New York which is built on top of a decommissioned train crossing. And obviously ours is still in use, so we built ours underneath. And they've planted over 70 different species of plants there, plants and flowers to beautify the area. Most of those, I'd say about 85% of the ones they planted are indigenous to Virginia. So it's a good wildlife preservation area as well. Or conservation area, I should say. I don't think it's officially been designated as a preservation area. All my turtle friends seem to have gotten bashful. We had a few sitting out here earlier today. Now right in front of us is a bridge that's known as a bascule style bridge. And bascule is a French word which means balance scale, or it can be synonymous with seesaw. And you'll notice a chamber on the top right hand side, almost looks like a large metal roof perched on top of that side of the bridge. That's full of stone. It acts as a counterweight for the bridge. So what they would do when a ship needed to come through this passage in the canal is they would pull the bridge over to the right, so clockwise into a vertical position. The large chamber of rock would rotate down and to the right, the horizontal section of the bridge would rotate up and to the right until it was vertical, and ships could come on through. That would have been originally built in 1929, and it was moved by horses. Believe it or not, it's so well balanced, it only took 2 horses to pull it into an upright position. Now today, the bridge is still in use. This is the 28th Street Bridge, but they have welded it so that it no longer raises and lowers. The canal ceased to be in any kind of real use in the 1870s, and by 1877 out of use completely. And it took until 1985 for them to decide to weld it shut. I'm not sure why they took as long as they did, but my guess is there was probably a city council committee or something in charge of it starting in about 1950. And one last interesting fact about this bridge is based on a design by Leonardo da Vinci. The man was well ahead of his time. The bridge based on his designs is still in use in 2025. He lived in the 1500s. Yes, ma'am.
Talked about the tobacco.
Yes.
I see the sign looks right. How did that day come about? And
I am not sure other than the match. RJ Reynolds, I believe, was around. Philip Morris was around. There were about 50 major manufacturers of tobacco. Every one of them had a warehouse and or factory along the road here. And they would have been actually a lot closer to the canal than today's buildings are, but they kept moving the buildings back because of flooding. And obviously you can't make a lot of profit on soaking wet tobacco. I got there's a pretty good sized turtle friend off to the right here.
so where is it? Oh, is that
Submerged.
Oh,
Usually he peeks up just long enough for about 3 people to look at it and then he comes up. Or they, I should say, there are dozens of them all do the same thing. Sometimes I picture the turtles on the water saying, "Hey Frank, what? I'm gonna bob my head up, watch all the humans." And as soon as we load the ducks on there, they laugh. We're passing along right around 26th and 25th Street area of Richmond. Now, 25th Street, if you take it 5 blocks north of here, will intersect with Broad Street, which is a significant intersection in our nation's history because at that corner sits St. John's Episcopal Church. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the history, but at the time it was known as the Henrico Parish or the Marina or Verona Parish. It had different names at the time. And in March of 1775, the Second Virginia Assembly met there to decide what to do about the tensions we were having with Great Britain. Now, this meeting was known as an extra legal meeting, which is a fancy way of saying they were breaking the law, because the British governor, Governor Dunmore, had forbade them from meeting in the courthouses of the capital further into the downtown area of Richmond. Nevertheless, they arranged to meet there. That was one of the biggest buildings in Richmond at the time that would house everybody. They had more than 120 delegates, we believe, including George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, Benjamin Harrison, Edmund Randolph, George Wythe, and of course, Patrick Henry. And it was on that site where Patrick Henry gave his famous "Give me liberty or give me death" speech. St. John's Episcopal. They still have reenactments there every Sunday afternoon, and it's full dress. You have several gentlemen who will come in dressed as delegates and reenact the scene. Now, you would have to imagine, though, that originally there were in excess of 100 people there, and these guys were hot and sweaty. There was no air conditioning, but it wasn't too bad, being that it was March. But crammed in a building like that and debating for days on end. They had been there since about a Tuesday of that week, and this was Friday when Patrick Henry stood up to give his speech. It was, I think, about 3 hours long, but as they got to the climax of the speech, and I'll paraphrase, I have not memorized it word for word, but there's debate about the actual word for word transcription we do have. And Patrick Henry states, "Men cry peace, peace, but there is no peace. War has already begun. The next gale we hear out of the north will be the sound of clashing arms. Our brethren are already in the field. Why sit we here idle? Is life so precious? Is peace so dear as to be purchased with the bonds of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death." Now, it's interesting that this did have a powerfully influential effect on the delegates there. However, the vote was still close. The final vote regarding whether to pursue independence was 65 to 55. So if only 6 of the delegates had voted to remain loyal to Great Britain, we might still be under British control today. In which case we would be calling on Trump's boots, bathrooms to do. So that's not the way it turned out. I find that one of the great ironies that Patrick Henry would speak so fervently about bondage when most of the men in the room themselves actually held enslaved people in bondage at the time. They were not entirely unaware of this, and the debate raged even then about what to do about slavery as an institution. So much so that when they got together in 1787, so about 12 years after that, we had won the war for independence, Congress decided that they would delay any discussion about the topic of slavery. They would not officially pass any laws or even talk about it in Congress for 20 years. We're going to table the discussion for 20 years, and that was really as a concession to southern states who still very much relied on enslaved labor for the tobacco industry and later the cotton industry. Ladies and gentlemen, a boat full of native Richmonders. A boat full of native Richmonders. So that is sort of a dark spot in our city's history and definitely our nation's history. For anybody who's a history buff, there is an excellent museum, the American Civil War Museum. It's got two of its three buildings are here in Richmond. One is at the old Tredegar Iron Works, which during the Civil War would have been the location that produced more than half of the Confederate cannons and muskets, rifle balls, rifles, any kind of iron product. And the other is what is being called today the White House of the Confederacy. It's simply what they call the Executive Mansion during the Civil War era. You can still tour both of those locations today. Now, we're coming up on this end of the flood wall. You see this large concrete wall to our right, chain link fence around the parking area, and the wall. And this section, the northern part of the wall, is around 4,000 feet, a little bit longer than 4,000 feet. There's also a southern section south of the James River, which is closer to 13,000 feet of change. Altogether, it took over 22,000 cubic yards. Sorry, 20 million cubic yards of concrete. I'll have to also zero. Good at history, not quite as good at that. Huge undertaking. This was only built around 1995. To me, it sounds like yesterday, even though that was 30 years ago. But Richmond's had several significant floods in its history that have ranged anywhere from filling Chaco Bottom up to 14 feet underwater, and then as high as 28 feet underwater. The flood wall is designed to hold up to, I think it's 32-foot maximum height before we have to start being really concerned. We've never had to close all of the gates. There are about 19 gates in the flood wall. We test them every year. The closest we've come was back in 2020. Just as a precaution, they closed several of the gates, anticipating that there might be a large downpour from the hurricane. I don't know how it's on. But the most recent flood of any note that we've had was Gaston in 2003. And the flood wall was here, but in spite of that, we still have waters up to 14 feet deep in Chaco Bottom. Even up to float cars away from the area, ruined several businesses. And essentially what happened is the drains backed up. So what you find out the hard way is that the flood wall is really good at keeping river water out, but it's also really good at keeping rainwater in if you don't have significant drainage. And along this side of Dock Street, just beyond the flood wall, sits a building known as the Virginia Holocaust Museum. You may have seen signs for parking over here. That museum has a lot of exhibitions to relate what it would have been like during World War II for those who were imprisoned in concentration camps in Germany. Prior to that, during the Civil War era, sat a building that was known as Libby Prison. Libby Prison started out as a three-story warehouse. It was owned by the Libby family, who were chandlers. They made candles for ships. But when the Civil War started, the Confederacy commandeered that building and used it as a prison. In 1861, they had as many as 700 prisoners from the Union Army, some officers, some enlisted. By 1862, that number had grown to over 1,000, and 1,000 was considered the maximum capacity that the prison could hold. So they ended up shipping out the enlisted men to Andersonville Prison in Georgia, which was the only prison in the Confederacy that had a worse reputation for conditions than the Libby Prison here in Richmond. Now, while there would have been terrible conditions, there was some relief in the form of a young lady named Elizabeth Van Loo. And she was a resident here in Richmond who would bring clothes and food to the Union soldiers to provide comfort. Sometimes she would also smuggle in money, and the soldiers would be able to bribe their way out of the prison. Now, Elizabeth had been born and raised here in Richmond, but she spent some of her youth attending a parents was further north. And we think that that may be where she got some of her sensibilities as far as supporting abolition of slavery. So she became a valuable spy for the Union and was able to deliver messages from the prisoners and from her own observations to Union officers. She even came up with a cipher to smuggle the messages out and hollowed out eggs. Sometimes she would also send flowers to Mrs. Grant, and the bouquet would be wrapped in Richmond newspapers, which reported articles about the coming to go away. She was later rewarded with a postmastership. Try to watch your elbows through the wall. Yes. Yeah, this is one of the 19 floodgates right here. We're actually passing through the actual flood walls. And if you have some time and want to walk down to this area, to our right, directly to the right, there are some markings on the flood wall to show you how high the flood waters have gotten for various floods over the years. And again, up to, I think the highest was over 28 feet. So almost the height equivalent to the length of this boat. This boat's about 30 feet. This, of course, is the Shaco neighborhood. We have two main sections, Shaco Bottom, which we're in at the moment. And as we go further west, it becomes Shaco Slip. Shaco Slip because it was at one time a boat slip. Shaco Bottom because it's basically at the bottom of the city as far as its elevation. Now, the word Shaco came from an indigenous or Native American word which referred to the name of a large flat rock that marked the end of Shaco Creek. And you can't really see Shaco Creek, it's been sort of lost to history, but the name is stuck. So we still refer to the neighborhoods of Shaco Bottom and Shaco Slip. I spent many a night down in Shaco Bottom. There used to be a wonderful blues club there. That also, sadly, has been lost to history. But if you can get a chance to see Henry Box Brown's replica box, it'll be on the right here. You can kind of through these rails, you should see it as we drift by. So not the electrical box, but the darker brown. Looks almost like a cube. That's also got a diagram of the way Henry would have curled himself up into his box. I'll also share with you that this section on the inside of the Canal Cruise, the Canal Walk, is about 1.25 miles that you can walk, and along the way there are about 22 historical medallions that give you a lot of the same information I've given you, but also even more. The boat operators, we all talk amongst each other about how there's far more material than you can cover in a 45-minute tour, and each of us takes kind of our own approach to it. More native Richmonders to your right. More native Richmonders to the right. Now, we haven't talked much about William Byrd II. I'll share with you about him. So much in Richmond is named after William and his family. Byrd Street, Byrd Park, Byrd Theater. William Byrd II was from England. His father, William Byrd I, owned a lot of plantation land along either side of the river before Richmond was here. And he passed along with his son when he passed. In the early 1700s. So William II came back over from England where he was living took control of his father's property to his area. And the Virginia general simply convinced him that he should release some of the land that he owned so that trading posts could be established. And while he wasn't terribly happy about it, he agreed to go along with it. They came to an agreement as far as compensation for the land. Richmond, in its original form, was plotted out as a trading post. And William one day was standing atop Libby Hill, which is at the far end of the canal, about where we were at the bridge where he turned around. When he looked down on the James River, he was reminded of his home of England, which was called Richmond on the Thames. So he decided that he would name our little trading port Richmond, and that name is held to this very day. And later, William Byrd II would pass his fortune down to William Byrd III, who none of this is named for because he lost almost all the fortune in gambling. They couldn't stick with naming everything after William Byrd II, even though this name doesn't. All right, so as we